Welcome to our overview of integrating restorative practices into a school-wide discipline plan. This presentation will review the principles of PBIS and RP and provide considerations for how these approaches may be used together to build a comprehensive, multi-tiered system of support for all students. By the end of this video, you'll be able to describe the guiding principles for positive behavior interventions and supports, which we will call PBIS, and restorative practices, which we'll refer to as RP. In addition, you'll be able to define key differences and similarities between these two approaches and describe general strategies for combining PBIS and restorative practices within the universal level Tier 1 of support. This module is not intended to teach you the specific details for implementing either PBIS or restorative practices. When implemented with fidelity, PBIS systems provide the foundation to support students with a wide range of needs in the least restrictive setting possible. But to see long-term success and sustainability, school-based teams must develop systems to support implementation. Systems refer to policies, procedures, and resources that allow individuals to use new practices efficiently and effectively. With PBIS, leadership teams are responsible for developing systems to support their staff's use of evidence-based practices, as well as systems to support effective decision-making and data use amongst staff. The systems developed by leadership teams are used in combination with one another to promote social competence, academic achievement, and pro-social behaviors in their students. In other words, when deciding to implement a new strategy, PBIS teams must make sure to focus not only on the evidence-based and philosophical fit of the new practice, but also on the systems-level changes that will make the practice easy to use and ensure that it will continue for as long as it's needed. At the Tier 1, or the universal level of support, PBIS is characterized by clearly defined school-wide expectations that reflect the values, backgrounds, and experiences of all students who attend the school. The school-wide expectations are taught throughout the entire school year and referenced throughout the day on a daily basis. The expectations are a part of day-to-day life in the school building, and students can often be observed being recognized for acting in ways that exemplify the expectations' meaning. This ongoing teaching, prompting, and rewarding of expectations has an uplifting effect on school climate and helps to prevent a good deal of misbehavior. When misbehavior does occur, effective consequences are applied to the infraction. These consequences are most often instructional in nature and include references to the school-wide expectations. Because an understanding of the types of behaviors occurring across the campus is a necessary part of providing Tier 1 support, staff throughout the school consistently abide by guidelines for data collection for both classroom-managed and office-managed infractions. The school's PBIS team pulls this data on a monthly basis to identify the types of skills that are needed and the common locations and times of day when instruction and reward incentives are most needed. If students continue to struggle with certain skills, lesson plans and consequences are adjusted to more directly address students' needs. Finally, universal screening takes place at least twice each year to proactively identify students who could use an extra layer of support. To help you see how restorative practices could be integrated within PBIS later on, it may be helpful to describe some characteristics of discipline within a PBIS system in more detail. Schools that implement PBIS with fidelity use consequences that are most often instructional in nature and include references to the school-wide expectations. Consequences for behavioral infractions could include strategies that target the events and environment surrounding a student, as opposed to focusing entirely on the student and his or her actions. For example, consequences in a PBIS system could include changes to a student's classroom or schedule, or changes in the way academic instruction is delivered. Consequences for behavioral infractions in PBIS systems consider the function of the student's behavior prior to determining the student's punishment. For example, if a student is repeatedly late to class in order to avoid the teacher's first activity, a function-based consequence would focus on ways to prevent the student from avoiding that activity. Not to be overlooked, discipline within a PBIS system should be designed and implemented in a culturally responsive manner. This ensures that student and family values are respected and increases the likelihood that parents will support the school's disciplinary decisions. When addressing misbehaviors, consequences used in PBIS systems aim to keep students in the learning environment to the greatest extent possible. Consequences which remove the student from the classroom and/or school are used only when absolutely necessary, such as in situations where a student or staff member's safety is at risk. The point behind disciplinary consequences in a PBIS system is to reduce the likelihood that an inappropriate behavior will reoccur. Solely punitive or shame-based consequences, such as those used in which the goal is to shame the person who caused harm into feeling regret for their actions, are least likely to be effective in preventing future occurrences and are used less frequently, if at all. Rewards that have been earned by the student for demonstrating the school-wide expectations are never taken away as punishment. However, if a student has not yet earned the reward, a consequence could sometimes include the failure to earn it. Consequences that are delayed in time from the inappropriate behavior, such as those assigned through an office-managed referral, are much less likely to impact a student's future behavior than those immediate consequences the student experiences right after the behavior occurs. Because of this, delays in disciplinary actions, such as waiting periods for a suspension room, should be avoided when possible. PBIS is broad enough to address a wide range of student and staff needs. PBIS systems include explicit procedures for using data to identify supports that are needed by students, including Tier 1 instruction, school-wide screening, and use of progress monitoring and fidelity data to identify effective supports for students with severe behaviors. The emphasis on prevention and the role of the environment helps to ensure that interventions are not merely responses to problems that have already occurred, allowing educators to be proactive in addressing student behavior. Perhaps most importantly, PBIS's reliance on data provides a way to make certain that local adaptations and strategies incorporated from related initiatives are effective with a school's unique population of students. But what exactly is restorative practices? Restorative practices is not an add-on program for behavior management. It is not just another tool in the toolbox for staff to use to deal with students' behavior. Instead, it represents a school culture that permeates all aspects of school organization and relationships within the school, as well as relationships between the school and its community. It recognizes that schools are educational institutions, so the school's response to children's behavior should be consistent with education's goals of supporting teaching and learning, not punishment, retribution, and exclusion. There are a number of terms and practices that are included under the restorative umbrella, and each of these terms refer to strategies that employ a common philosophy regarding interpersonal relationships and appropriate responses to actions that create conflict or cause harm to individuals and communities. One of the original terms used to refer to restorative strategies was the term restorative justice, which is used within the justice system as a way to repair the harm inflicted as a result of a crime that has been committed. Typically, the practices in restorative justice are reactive in nature and occur only after some criminal activity has taken place. Restorative practices is a broader term which applies the principles and processes developed in restorative justice to any setting, including juvenile justice, community centers, workplaces, schools, families, and so on. Just as with restorative justice, The focus of restorative practices is to repair harm that was caused by the actions of an offender or person who caused harm. The goals of restorative practices include providing restitution to those that were harmed, including the person who was harmed and sometimes the broader community, repairing the relationship between the person who caused the harm and the harmed parties, and reintegrating the person who caused the harm back into his or her community. It's important to note that sometimes, in addition to the support provided to the person who was harmed, restorative practices may include the provision of some form of support to the person who caused harm in order to correct the circumstances that led the person who caused harm to engage in his or her harmful activity. Other terms that are sometimes used in the same way as restorative discipline, such as circles, mediation, or conferencing, refer to practices that are used throughout the restorative process as a way to build relationships, teach necessary skills, and facilitate the restoration of harm caused by misbehavior. Although these practices are sometimes used by schools as alternatives to traditional discipline, they may not always be applied with a restorative mindset. In other words, while these terms may be used in conversations about restorative discipline, they may not always be reflective of restorative practices. We will use the acronym RP to describe restorative practices that may be used to prevent or address student misbehavior in the school setting. There are 5 general principles that guide the implementation of restorative discipline in schools. These are sometimes referred to as the 5 R's, which stands for relationships, respect, responsibility, restoration, and reintegration. Each of these principles are central to the philosophy of restorative discipline and critical to the way in which restorative discipline is delivered. Relationships are the cornerstone of restorative discipline, as many of the practices within the restorative discipline continuum are most effective when authentic relationships between students and between teachers and students are in place. A comprehensive approach to restorative discipline includes a deliberate focus on building relationships throughout the school and creating systems to help establish and strengthen healthy relationships. Respect is a critical feature inherent in every aspect of restorative discipline and a defining aspect of interactions between individuals. The people who caused harm are treated with the same degree of respect as the people who were harmed, while maintaining respect for the experience of the person or persons experiencing harm. Maintaining respect for all parties allows the person who was harmed to have a voice in the disciplinary process and helps to improve the behavior of the students and staff members involved. With restorative discipline, responsibility is learned by understanding the impact one's actions have had on others and agreeing to be accountable for engaging in those actions. Restoration is a process through which the person who caused harm demonstrates accountability for their actions. The person who was harmed is an active participant in identifying how this will take place, using a collaborative problem-solving process with the assistance of a mediator. Retribution is not the end result of this process. Instead, the goal is to identify strategies to alleviate the harm caused by the actions of the person who caused harm. Many times, this can be achieved through careful discussion and out-of-the-box thinking, empowering all of the parties involved and encouraging personal growth. Reintegration is the final guiding principle of restorative discipline, which refers to the steps taken to ensure that the person who caused harm is welcomed back into his or her community following their offense. It is meant to restore the positive relationship between the person who caused harm and their community, setting the stage for renewed engagement and positive interactions. The goals and likely outcomes of restorative practices includes positive relationships between students, teachers, and families. These positive relationships are believed to be a preventative factor for problem behaviors, which can lead to a lower rate of office referrals and suspensions. In addition to improved relationships, The philosophy of restorative discipline includes a strong emphasis on community, which includes a greater emphasis on inclusion for students who might otherwise be removed from the classroom because of their behavior. This emphasis on inclusion will likewise support a reduction in exclusionary discipline practices, as exclusion would be the opposite of an approach that advocates for positive relationships and community. A school that implements restorative discipline with fidelity is a school that provides a range of supports to its students, many of which are at least partially determined by students and their families. These supports may be offered to the person who caused harm as a way of addressing the conditions that led the person who caused harm to bring harm to the person who was harmed or the community. Restorative approaches share a common goal of giving the people who were harmed a voice in the resolution of the incident. Because of this, students, families, and community stakeholders are seen as partners in the educational process, rather than just recipients of services provided by the school. Restorative practices have been found to be most effective when implemented as a whole school initiative. In these circumstances, preventative strategies are used in conjunction with disciplinary strategies, and all staff are involved in implementation. Restorative practices have also been implemented on a setting-specific basis, such as within single classrooms or in specific settings on campus, such as a playground or cafeteria. Restorative practices have been used as an administrative option for addressing office-managed behaviors. And of course, restorative practices have also been used within juvenile justice and community settings. With small shifts in the language used during restorative practice sessions, these practices have been used successfully with children of all ages. It is important to note that when restorative practices are used as anything but a whole school approach, it becomes increasingly difficult to ensure students and staff have the skills necessary to participate in the process. And the overall effectiveness of restorative practices for school level outcomes is diminished. Another way of conceptualizing the continuum of restorative practices is to think about how they might fit within your school's multi-tiered system of support. There may be some practices that might be used with all students as part of Tier 1, some that might be used with small groups of students as part of Tier 2 interventions, and some strategies that would only be used with a small number of individual students in a more intensive fashion. When thinking about restorative practices at Tier 1, it will be critical to consider the types of knowledge and skills needed from your staff, as well as your students, to participate in the different practices. At a minimum, all staff will need to be familiar with the guiding principles of restorative discipline and be open to the idea that discipline does not always need to result in something punitive in order to be effective. More than likely, all staff will also need expertise with effective statements and restorative questioning so that they may prompt for these scripts during relevant moments. Students will also need to learn how to use affective statements and how to respond to restorative questioning, so they may participate in these practices as needed and build fluency within those skills. If the school decides to utilize circles, staff will need to be comfortable teaching their students how to participate in this process and also be comfortable dealing with the different topics that may come up during the process. To help with this, circles may be structured so that some topics are more likely to come up than others. For instance, circles may be structured in a number of different ways in order to teach social skills, build relationships, address conflict, or even support academics. Alternatively, circles may be structured so that students have the opportunity to speak about matters that are personally significant to them, such as a violent incident that they witnessed or their fear of failing to graduate from high school. On the next slide, we will show you an example of a restorative circle. Good morning, Geneva. Good morning, Cadence.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning, Caitlin.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning, Anna.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning, Charlie. Good morning, Amelia.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning, RJ.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning, Zach.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning, Bud.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning,
Good
Noel.
morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning, Anae.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning, Devesh.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Good morning, Sam.
Good morning, Mrs.
Good morning, Willow.
Good morning, Mrs. Howell.
Welcome to Friday. Today we have math logic games for math. We also have free centers for reading.
Yay!
And we have 2 birthday books that we have to make today. We're going to make one for Devesh and one for RJ. Now, Devesh has chosen that he's going to actually have his birthday book read next week. He's going to bring in a special book. And RJ's mom is coming in later to do his story. So, today's circle, I'd like you guys to close your eyes for me. And I want you to think about something that you want to get better at in 1st grade. I want you to picture yourself getting better at something. And what is your goal for the rest of 1st grade? Open your eyes. Now today we're going to pass around the microphone as our talking stick, so that way we can hear what you have to say. Now remember that if you have something that's the same, or something that someone else has a goal and you're like, that's a really good idea, give them that me too sign. Okay, who would like to start our circle? Oh, so many people. Amelia, we're going to start with you. What's your goal for this?
I want to get better at Lexia.
Lexia.
I want to get better at reading, Lexia, and writing. I want to get better at reading, Lexia, and writing.
Let's see, Geneva has that me too sign.
I want to get better at reading. I want to get better at Lexia. I want to get better at Lexia, reading, and writing. I want to get better at Lexia.
Lexia also. RJ, what's your goal?
I want to get better at Lexia, reading, and writing, and doing nice handwriting.
Ooh, so many goals. Do you guys know what I love? Did you hear all the complete sentences? Wow. Okay, keep going, Beth.
I want to get better at Lexia.
Period.
I want to get better at behaving at Lexia. Get better at Lexia.
I want to get better at using technology during math. That's my goal.
I want to get better at reading. I want to get better at being a better friend. I want to get better at writing, drawing realistic.
Realistic drawing. Zach, what do you want to get better at?
I want to get better at reading.
Thank you. You guys all have some really good goals. Did any of you guys hear some other goals that you're like, hey, I can do that too?
Yeah.
Awesome. So we're going to have a really fantastic Friday. We have a lot to get done today. And then we'll have a great 3-day weekend. So everyone just put your hand in front of you. Right there, right in front of you. On the count of 3, should we say perseverance? 1, 2, 3.
Perseverance!
Okay, so we're going to head to our base so we can do our first birthday book. Let's see if we can get to our base in 10. Some schools may forego the use of preventative or skill-building circles and opt to focus on restorative strategies that are used solely as a response to misbehavior. Some strategies, such as restorative questioning, can be informal and relatively quick, and involving only the person who caused harm and a mediator. Other strategies, such as restorative conferences, are much more structured, take more time to complete, and include all of the parties involved in an offense, their respective supporters, and members of the community who were impacted by the offense. The type of restorative practice strategy used to address a misbehavior should be aligned to the severity of the offense. For example, a restorative conference, which is a highly structured meeting involving the person who was harmed, the person who caused harm, and their supporters, would not be necessary for a relatively minor offense, such as a temporary disruption of academic instruction. As the intensity of the restorative strategy increases, the amount of preparation necessary to engage in the strategy will also increase. For example, the willingness of each party to participate in a mediation or restorative conference must be determined prior to selecting these practices as a consequence for the offense. If supporters will be present for the meeting, scheduling concerns must also be taken into account. While the more formal restorative practices may not offer a quick fix for administrators, these practices do offer an opportunity for growth and transformation for each of the parties involved and can be powerful tools to help our students. As a reminder, the last three strategies fall along the restorative justice continuum. Overall, the use of restorative practices offers the potential for educators to achieve a number of positive outcomes for their students and staff, including increasing social and emotional skills, strengthening relationships, improving school climate, identifying student needs that may otherwise be overlooked, reducing their use of exclusionary discipline practices, and increasing stakeholders' participation and voice in the discipline process. Why would a school that is already implementing PBIs want to add restorative practices? Isn't that just another program, jumping on the latest educational bandwagon, something else teachers are expected to do? There are good reasons a school might consider integrating restorative practices into PBIS. Restorative practices has the potential to, one, reduce out-of-school suspensions even if PBIS has already reduced them to some extent. Two, reduce racially or ethnically disproportionate suspensions. And three, improve school climate for students, staff members, and families. During the last decade, some schools and districts across the U.S. have been integrating restorative practices and PBIS. What difficulties have been reported? Listed here are some typical complaints. These issues may be related to failure to implement with fidelity, perhaps due to inadequate training or being understaffed. First, there is a perception that there is not enough time, true of everything we do, whether it is our personal or professional life. Secondly, problem behaviors are not being reduced. And lastly, there may be the perception that those who misbehave are not being held accountable. PBIS strategies are generally regarded as having a strong emphasis on prevention, which includes proactive changes to the school environment, as well as frequent instruction on social skills. PBIS utilizes evidence-based strategies drawn from the field of applied behavior analysis in particular. At the same time, PBIS leaders acknowledge the necessity of developing practices that are easily used by implementers and can be sustained over time, which necessitates an emphasis on data collection and evaluation to ensure that those practical strategies are effective. The success of PBIS has been replicated across a wide variety of settings, content areas, and with recipients of different ages and ability levels, and has maintained reliably successful outcomes even after being integrated with other initiatives, including academics and mental health. Restorative practices, on the other hand, are generally regarded as having a strong emphasis on relationships and community, drawing on these interpersonal connections as the basis for unique disciplinary strategies. While restorative practices include practices that are intended to prevent problem behaviors, the emphasis in many restorative practices tends to revolve around repairing the harm caused by the actions of the person who caused the harm. Another difference between restorative practices and PBIS can be found in the emphasis placed on reintegrating the person who caused harm into the local community, which is also consistent with PBIS principles, but not always explicitly emphasized. Finally, many of the outcomes of restorative practices are achieved through the use of a single process known as circles, which are flexible enough to incorporate many different goals and purposes, but may be difficult for all students and staff to utilize effectively. For this reason, Some restorative trainers recommend that each school implementing restorative discipline appoint a full-time circle facilitator who has undergone specific and extensive training. Lessons learned from the field of PBIS may have something to contribute to the development of the field of restorative practices, as both approaches share a number of common goals and characteristics. For starters, both approaches count on an improved school climate, increases in social skills, and decreases in exclusionary discipline as likely outcomes of implementation. And both approaches include active student and family engagement in their activities. PBIS and restorative practices are frequently met with strong philosophical objections from staff as well as families who advocate for a get tough approach to misbehavior, which makes flexibility within certain guiding principles a key factor in successful implementation. Both approaches note key implementation drivers, such as strong leadership and staff development, as crucial for successful outcomes. And with both approaches, the level of success tends to vary by the level of implementation of each of the components. The pyramid helps illustrate the connection between restorative practices and PBIS by identifying the continuum of supports through the tiers. Recall that Tier 1 is a universal screener. It is designed for all students. Research indicates that approximately 80% of students will respond to Tier 1 interventions and support. The remaining 20% of the students may need additional assistance. Of those, approximately 15% will respond to Tier 2 interventions, and an estimated 5% of this group may require intensive interventions at the Tier 3 level. In restorative practices, prevention measures are implemented and skill building is supported through the use of peacekeeping circles. These circles are used with students for morning meetings, social emotional instruction, and with faculty or staff meetings. For PBIS, prevention and skill building target all students and are addressed through defining and teaching expectations, establishing a consequence system, and collecting and using data. For students who do not respond to Tier 1 strategies, restorative practices uses a variety of measures as alternatives to suspension: youth peer court, peer mediation, conflict resolution training, and restitution. PBIS uses strategies including check-in, check-out, and teaching social skills as interventions at the Tier 2 level. For those students requiring intensive interventions, restorative practices seeks to reintegrate the offender back into the community by holding victim offender meetings, family community group conferences, and restitution. Intensive interventions in PBIS includes function-based support and wraparound support. PBIS and restorative practices are aligned and support one another. They are complementary approaches that are capable of achieving similar outcomes, share similar values, and have similar challenges in implementation. Restorative practices are generally regarded as having a stronger emphasis on relationships and community, and utilizes unique disciplinary strategies that are developed by the community or individuals harmed by a misbehavior. The complementary strategies of restorative discipline and PBIS present an opportunity for educators to attain the benefits of both. While restorative practices offer an appealing opportunity to focus on interpersonal relationships and utilize a wider range of non-exclusionary discipline practices, PBIS offers systems, science, and evaluation procedures to help ensure its success and sustainability. The overall time savings from reduced office referrals obtained through PBIS may help create the time necessary to use more structured restorative approaches than would be otherwise possible without the benefits of PBIS. Clear definition of practices, along with a consistent focus on accurate data collection, would help to define restorative practices in a way that could be observed and measured over time, allowing teams to assess fidelity as well as overall effectiveness of the practices. Finally, regular data sharing with staff on the outcomes of restorative strategies would help to increase the likelihood that staff utilize the procedures, as well as identify needs for staff development or training. At Tier 1, the common language established through the teaching of the school-wide expectations could provide a mechanism for introducing affective statements and teaching the social and emotional skills needed to participate in restorative processes. For students whose problem behaviors are maintained in order to obtain attention through the restorative process, a reward system could provide incentives to refrain from those problem behaviors and earn attention by demonstrating appropriate behaviors. The consistent discipline procedures from Tier 1 PBIS may help staff sort out which restorative practices would be most appropriate for different situations. Both PBIS and restorative practices offer great potential for schools to improve climate and reduce their use of exclusionary disciplinary practices. Whether the schools choose to implement PBIS on its own, implement our restorative practices on its own, or implement some combination of the two approaches, any attempt at the implementation will be challenging without an understanding of the types of activities that lead to successful implementation. The National Implementation Research Network offers resources for schools to assess their readiness for change and identify the contextual fit of the proposed practices. Schools are encouraged to review their guide prior to taking on a new initiative. Here are some additional considerations that will need to be taken into account. First, utilizing restorative practices will be difficult until educators are convinced that getting tough is not an effective approach to behavior management. Secondly, a systematic process for evaluation for a model integrating restorative practices and PBIS are being developed. Until more research is done, schools will really need to look at fidelity and evaluate outcomes. Lastly, schools will need to identify a plan for implementation and rollout of restorative practices within their PBIS system.